The Repast Podcast may include detailed discussions about death, the human body after death, and the medical process that may be sensitive or disturbing to some listeners and viewers. Our goal is to educate and inform with respect and care. We encourage listener and viewer discretion, especially for younger audiences or those who may find these topics emotionally challenging.
And the retort, that's where the cremation takes place, has to be completely cleaned out before the next person is cremated.
Okay.
So
And that's all my mama
are their
did her.
ashes.
yeah, yes, that is her. Yeah.
You have her at home.
That's all her.
You don't have Sally Mae sitting on the counter.
Welcome back to the Repast Podcast. I'm Antonio Green, and joined with me as always is my brother Brice Green. Today's episode is titled Ashes and Empathy. And joining us today is our mom, Karla Cole Green, and we also have Dr. Rose Moten. Welcome to the Repast Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you
Pleasure.
both for being here. Appreciate it. Now, Mom, I'd like to start with you. Kind of a question that we always are asked in the funeral industry of what is it like to be surrounded by death all the time?
Oh, yes. I don't want to say that we get used to it. What I try and do, knowing that I am doing this every day and that people come into our office who have not experienced death every day, I try and put myself in their shoes and try and make them feel as comfortable as I can, and try and get them to just kind of relax, knowing that they're not used to being around the death industry like I am. But, sometimes when you're in it every day, you have to really, really make it a conscious effort, because it's almost like it's a job. Well, it is a job, but you make a conscious effort to relax people and to bring them in and make them feel comfortable.
Now, with those feelings and feeling comfortable and being okay in that surrounding, what are some of the things that you kind of see and feel on a daily basis that you'd be able to relate to people as something that we handle constantly?
Well, your feelings go out to people because they're hurting. And especially when people come in and they're crying, sometimes you almost want to sit down and cry with them, but you can't do it because you're a professional. You're here to do a job. But you feel for them. Even the staff, all of the staff feels for them. I had one family where it was a senior lady, lost her sister. It was basically just the two of them in this world together. And there was hardly nobody in the chapel for the funeral but this lady. Wow. And my staff ran downstairs. The girl said, no, we got to sit with her. We can't take this. We got to sit down there. We got to be with her. Once the funeral was over and the girls came back up to the office, they all were crying. They all wiping all their mascara off and all. So we get involved with the families because you're human and you feel for them. But you still have to be a professional and kind of take a step back so that you can lead them in the right direction and how to plan this funeral.
Understand that completely. I understand it. It's one of the things that we deal with on a constant, especially meeting with the families, right, and being in that close proximity with people. Like the family that I met with a while back, young lady in there said, well, I buried my mother last year. Now this is my father, but it's hard because now I have to actually clean out the house completely. Oh. And it's to the point where I even have to listen to the messages that were left on the answering machine. Wow. I said, we still had an answering machine? That was the first question. First question was, wow, they still had an answering machine? But the second part of that was, even I kind of got choked up a little bit just, thinking of our father, me and Antonio. And I told her, I said, well, one day you're going to be able to listen to it. So don't delete anything. Right. And I pulled out my phone in the office and I said, now look, this is a voicemail I have from my father. Now, whenever I want to hear his voice, I go to my phone and I click it and I listen to the voicemail. And she said, no, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I said, no, that's the kind of feelings that we deal with on a daily.
Yeah. And like in mortuary school, they always taught us in our psychology class was funeral directors, you have to have sympathy more than empathy. Mm-hmm. So, and that's because if you're empathetic, constantly every single day, which means you're taking on that person's grief. So sympathy, you feel for the person, you'll do what you can to help them. But empathy is when you put yourself in their shoes and you take on their emotions. So as funeral directors, of course, you're going to do that, especially when it's a child involved and, you get to think about your children. You can't help it. But on a daily basis, it's not healthy for us to take on that empathetic role. We have to make sure we have sympathy, but for our own peace of mind, you can't always have that empathetic role where you're taking on those emotions, especially when you're meeting with so many families on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a part of that self-care that was taught. As funeral directors, you have to have the ability to think of yourself. You have to go home at the end of the day as well.
Right.
You cannot take on all of that from every family you meet with. And I mean, especially in our situation, our business has been over 100 years and our grandfather has implemented it and great-grandfather has implemented it. But it gets to the situation of you have to know where to try to separate yourself and be able to have that self-care where you can care for the family, but also care for yourself. Now, Antonio, going on those lines, why don't you touch on some of the coping strategies that you either use or you've observed from other colleagues that you use to help deal with that daily emotion and stress of, honestly, the business?
I think it just comes down to knowing your limits. I know we can always get caught in the day-to-day and you're pushing yourself all day long, but it's got to be to the point where you know when to stop yourself and say, okay, well, I need to take a break, or, I need 10 minutes not to take any phone calls for a minute, and got to, recenter yourself and kind of get back to a place where you can take care of yourself. Like you said a few minutes ago, you have to be able to have that self-care always in mind, especially when you're dealing with difficult situations, whether it's a young person that's passed or whether it's just a big service, a highly publicized service where media is involved, and there's all sorts of other moving pieces you have to consider. You have to be okay with taking yourself out of the situation, at least for a short time, to be able to get yourself back centered and ready to take up the baton and keep going again.
And that's that's funny coming from one of us three that end up spending our whole entire waking day at the funeral home. Now, Mom, what about you? What kind of self-care strategies can you build on from there as well?
I just, like I said, I put myself in their shoes, but not to the point where I am just grieving as much as they are, of course, but try to feel for them as much as I can. But when I, go home, I have to think about myself, and I have to relax and start the day over anew the next day, and not take all those feelings home from the family, not take all those families' feelings home with me. So that's pretty much how I deal with it.
And Dr. Rose, what about you? I know you've got some good self-care strategies.
I do. This is such great insight, to get the behind the scenes, what you guys are saying. I really appreciate the fact that you made that distinction between empathy and sympathy as well, because it's so important to understand. It is important to have empathy. If you guys did not, you wouldn't be successful around for 100 years. But at the same time, it's so important to avoid emotional fatigue or compassion burnout. You have to understand where the line is drawn so you don't become too overwhelmed with it. So coping strategies is everything from a regular debriefing. Checking in on a regular and just debriefing your feelings. One of the things when I was trained in trauma debriefing, one of the things they really stress to us is the sooner you can just get to a person and have them debrief about something that's overwhelming or traumatic to them, the less likely it's going to have long-term effects. And I can only imagine being in this business for generations as long as you guys have, that you have a fine line where you have to balance being that emotional container, but at the same time not becoming desensitized to what people are experiencing. So I think coping strategies that help that is the regular debriefing, and also to make a priority to find ways to inject joy in your life outside of the workplace.
Yeah.
Why is it important to kind of for those who are exposed to the death industry, whether that be funeral directors in our sense, you have police officers and people that work at the medical examiner's office. Why is it important to focus on that mental health?
It's so important, and I'm so glad you guys, I think, are oftentimes, it's forgotten that you are exposed to this all the time. They think, okay, this is what you went into, so it has to be easy for you, and I'm sure it's not. But you mentioned police officers and fire officers. Again, going back now almost 30 years when I first went into the field of psychology, I remember the individual that I interned under sharing with me, and he had a contract with the Detroit Police Department, Detroit Fire Department, and he says, this is one of my biggest contracts, but we don't get the police officers and firemen in, we get their family members in, because they're so exposed to it on a regular basis. Like I said, sometimes it can be that desensitization, when you are exposed to traumatic death of a child or what have you, and then you go home to your young child who's complaining about something, and you may not even be able to meet that child where that child is, because you're thinking about, I just watched a kid die, and you're complaining about you couldn't get a popsicle today. So it's so important, for those are frontline individuals, yourselves and others who are exposed to this on a continuous basis, to be very careful. Your emotional container, you have to be this emotional container to do your job well, but at the same time, you want to make sure that it's not crossing that line of becoming hardened or desensitized.
And then have you seen, especially in the Black community, a unwillingness to reach out to get that emotional support?
Absolutely. It's a stigma too. It's long been a stigma. You're supposed to, be tough, be strong. And contrary to that, strong is actually reaching out for the help. It's actually being able to admit to your vulnerabilities and admit to that you're struggling emotionally. And of course, that has become better over time. We've seen that stigma and that taboo dissipate over time, but there's still much work to do.
Talk about a couple of those times where, I know you talked about one already, but speak about another one of those where it really, all of a sudden, you just saw this deep connection between staff and family.
Well, in another case, the family got real close to an elderly lady, and one of the employees actually sent a chef to this lady's house for a whole week with food, because was worried about her eating, and she paid out of her pocket, and had a chef deliver food to her house for a whole week. So things like that, the family just gets so attached to people. They call them, they make friends with them. They call them weeks after the service and check on them. How you doing, So the staff gets very affected too. Yeah.
And that's one of the things I love about our funeral home and how we are interacting with our families and how we treat our families, is that it's more of a, we're here for you, not business transaction. Right. And that's one of the things that I love about what we do. And I love about how our grandfather, your father, taught us how to care for people and just be there for people. This isn't just a business transaction. Right. This is the care for the community.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What would you say, Dr. Rose, from like a clinical perspective on the words? Like what type of words? So not only for us as funeral directors, but anybody who's dealing with somebody who's grieving, like what are words maybe that people should avoid when talking to grieving families, or what words should they use?
Oh, yeah, that's such a great question. I actually have done many talks on this before. Some things that, let me just say this first. When you have a loved one, a friend, a family member that's grieving, what you want is to take away their pain. So we have to understand the intentions behind the words, but we also have to understand some things can come off as very callous. So, and these are things that maybe people have normalized that you say. Even something as, how are you doing? You know, for a person grieving, like, you know, how do you think I'm doing, right? You know, that type of thing. Or I remember when my father died, my father 18 years was disabled following a stroke. My mom took total care of him. This dementia, he needed round-the-clock care. You know, I was 12 at the time and became an even caregiver to him. And I remember when he died 18 years later, even some of his own family members, his siblings, saying to my mom, well, that burden is gone now. And she got up in front of everybody at the funeral and let them know, you know, what she felt. You know, she's like, he was not my burden, he was my blessing. But, you know, things like that, well-meaning, but it can come off as very callous. Other things is they're out of their suffering now. Well-meaning, but can come off as callous. So I always encourage folks, you know, you don't even have to say anything. Getting back to when I've lost both my parents. I remember when my mom passed and, you know, people were coming over and, you know, offering, you know, it just gets cloudy at that time. But what really stood out to me, you know, people wanted to talk or find the right words, and it's hard, but you know, you want to say the right thing. But the friend that really stood out to me was the friend that came over and didn't say anything. She just sat next to me and put her hand on my hand and just held my hand.
No, she was there.
Let me know. And that was like transformative for me because no one else had did that, but that's exactly what I needed at that time. I didn't need words. I didn't need anyone to try to fix it. I always say grief is meant to be felt, not fixed. And oftentimes people come to you, your loved ones, and they want to fix it. They want to fix it so quickly. And that's just not the whole, that's not part of the process, is fixing it. Yeah.
Now, Antonio, as many families as you see throughout the day, what are some of the words, I'm gonna kick the question back to you. What are some of the words that you find yourself delivering as comfort and trying to at least ease a little bit of their grief so that we can then do our part as the funeral home?
I think things like, I try to avoid, how are you doing? Like, I try not to say that at all. I might say something like if a certain emotion came up, like, well, have you experienced this before? Or what is something that you're doing to take care of yourself? To let family, because I know some directors too, like myself and a couple others, like, will ask, like, well, have you eaten today? You know, have you, drink water, drink fluids. So I think it's just making sure that they're taking care of themselves. Like Dr. Rose says, not so much what you say, but just the care, the questions that you're asking, and just to allude that care to them. And also it's the tone, because you can say something that's that you think is fine, and it might be fine, the words are fine, but your tone might be real dry. Like, well, hope you're all right today. It's like, it just sounds real dry, and it doesn't sound like you're sympathetic to them at all, then they'll pick up on that. So I think the tone behind whatever you say, because even when people, even like some of the receptionists sometimes, like they'll say, oh, hi, how are you doing today? And I think even the tone where people know, like, they're trying to be friendly, even though that may not be what they want to hear. But I think most times that people will understand, like, your tone. If you're warm and caring, then they'll latch on to that. Right. And then other people, now sometimes we've had people say just that. Well, how do you think I'm feeling? My mama's dead. Like, sorry. But then you can't take that personally too. So that's where that training comes in, as just staff, not even just funeral director, but staff, is you can't take those things personally, because it's an emotional lash out. And it's something, they may have just had an argument in the car, on the phone, or with a family member. And you were the first person they came in contact, and that's how they lashed out. So that's what a lot of those emotional responses are, just that. They're not thought out. They're not something directed at you, but it's just a visceral emotional reaction.
And then it's funny you said about have you eaten? Because I remember a family, it was a while back, a family came in, it was about 5 people. One of them was an older lady that was a friend of the family, but we had just done her relative service not too long ago, and she met with you. And once everything was over with at the Boulevard Chapel, we made arrangements and whatnot. That's when she said, well, your brother's Antonio, right? I said, yeah, that's my brother. That's my brother. And she said, well, tell him thank you, because when I don't remember what relative it was, but she said, when I had my service and he did the arrangements, he asked me, had I eaten? And I had thought about it. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. And it wasn't until he said something and I felt somebody checking up on me that I said, you know what? I need to get me something to eat. And I said, well, that's right. You do. You got to take care of yourself because you got to keep going, even though you're going through this time. Yeah.
And sometimes families want to, you want to relax them, and sometimes with humor. Humor. You can, I can crack a joke with families, and I can see how they just come right out of their shell, and they're like, "Oh, I can kind of relax here. This isn't all that stiff, stiff funeral home stuff. I can relax. She even cracked the joke. It's okay to smile. It's okay to laugh. So I find humor helps a lot of people.
Right. Yeah, I think that's people's misconceptions when they enter a funeral home. They think you have to be stoic, and I mean sometimes that's the environment too. When you're coming, if you're meeting, with somebody older and they're stoic themselves and just looking at you and like they're half in the grave themselves, then that's what they're gonna feel. So they're gonna react accordingly. But when somebody is warmer and you're bringing out those, a joyous, they're trying to get them to talk about a more joyous occasion or a good memory, and then they can start smiling or laughing even, then they'll appreciate that and warm up easier and quicker.
Now on to the next portion of our podcast that we always do. We go into Mythbusters. Is it true that ashes of cremated loved ones are not all their ashes?
Those are their ashes, and people really don't understand what ashes are. So what ashes are is the bone, and it's the pulverized bone. So after the cremation's done, it's the skeletal remains that are there. It's not a pile of ashes. So those skeletal remains have to be processed, and that's what makes the ashes. And the retort, that's where the cremation takes place, has to be completely cleaned out before the next person is cremated. Okay. So
that's all my mama did her.
Yeah, yes, that is her. Yeah.
You have her at home.
That's all her.
You don't have Sally Mae sitting on the counter.
Now, Mom, is it true that all caskets are sealed airtight?
No, not all caskets are. And some caskets are what they call, they used to call them sealers back in the day, sealers and non-sealers. Now they call them gasketed and non-gasketed. That means that there's a gasket that runs around the entire length and width of the casket. And once you've seen a funeral director take a key and crank the casket closed, it just makes the casket close a little tighter, but they don't guarantee that those caskets are air and waterproof. Really, if you're looking for something to keep air and water out, I would say get a good vault. Good vaults is what protects your loved ones. But the casket itself, not all of them seal. Some of them are non-sealed, but they don't give you any guarantee from the casket company.
And the vault, that's that outer container that the casket goes into. So sometimes cemeteries refer to them as outer burial containers or grave liners, but vaults in particular will be the sealed. If you just have a cement box or a grave liner, chances are it's not going to be sealed, but the vault is what's going to be sealed, and most of them have guarantees for 10, 20, some go up to 90 and 100 years.
Now, I'm going to throw in my own mythbuster that families have asked me. When we get to that portion of the arrangements and we talk about a vault, families say, well, doesn't the casket just go in the ground?
Right.
Now, no, it does not. Right. But explain why families never really see the vault either.
Well, so it depends on the cemetery and the part of the country you're in. Now, there's still Down south, there's still portions where you don't use a vault. If you're in an old country cemetery, they may just put the casket right in the ground. But if you ever notice, those cemeteries are hilly. Those old country cemeteries have hills and dips. So that's because there aren't vaults that were used. So the ground constantly sinks in over time. So the purpose of a basic grave liner or vaults is to keep the cemetery grounds level. And it keeps that ground from caving in over time.
You just got a small idea of how funeral professionals cope with the emotional weight of their work and the importance of emotional support and empathy. But there's more to the story. In part 2, we shift into the chaos of the COVID-19 era and how it affected emotional support efforts. We'll also talk about what it's like to handle high-profile deaths under pressure. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.